No, thanks for the introduction, Pat. Yep, my name's Edward Farrell. Just a quick overview of the talk. I'm going to go into a bit of why I've done this, a bit about Recon, tools and techniques that are necessary for exploration, some of the data sets I've got as well, and some Recon-y stuff outside of corporate pen testing. Now, most of what I'm talking about here is around... I go a bit into history, and then I start looking at, well, me as a pen tester running my own pen testing business, what exactly I do and what I'm interested in. So, as Pat said, I run my own pen testing firm out of Sydney. I'm a firm advocate of flat ducks. I've been in the tech space now for just over 10 years, and InfoSec, I'm not going to use that word, for about 7 years. But look, the root of this talk, and I think this was inspired by... I do a lot of reading in my spare time. And there were 2 or 3 books I was reading through last year that were real awesome ones. If you get a chance of it, Phil Lapsley's book on the old freakers in the US from about the 50s up until even before then, all the way through till recent times, talked about how a lot of them really did it not so much for any financial gain, but to understand how technology works. And this is where I come in and say it's a bit of a lost art. I mean, you look at another book, a little less known, Bill Apro's book on an investigation he was doing for the AFP back in the 90s. A lot of the characters he interacted with outside of the criminals, once again, were a part of doing this as a matter of interest and a matter of personal curiosity. Same goes, the 414 is a documentary that was released very recently. Guys from Wisconsin who just found a heap of vulnerabilities back in the 80s. And once again, these were just teenagers who were just curious what was there. And so much of that has actually fed into not only our industry, the top left photo there, the Loft, who I'd say have done a lot in terms of creating whatever this industry is, but also Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak and the Homebrew Computer Club of the in San Francisco, for example. A lot of the stuff they were doing was once again about curiosity and a bit of borderline legality, but once again, there's that word there. Where is all of this heading? And this has been an observation I've had probably the last 2 to 3 years, where a lot of these events and a lot of these community-run events are now starting to become a lot more mainstream. They're becoming a lot more corporate. I've just spent the last week in an office with a lot of guys I interacted with several years ago who used to all be in black shirts, who are now, of course, in suits. We're also seeing, and this is a big criticism that's come out of another organisation I work for, in fact a weakness, we're also seeing a loss of what I would call intuitive command line interaction, all the way going now all the way down to our only interaction with technology is through flashy screens going pichu pichu and cyber. But we're also losing a lot of the craft. We've had some really great talks here from the last speaker, Hugh, on what could almost be best described as a craft industry to a really sort of heavily processed activity in the form of pen testing. Another colleague I was even speaking to earlier this morning was talking about how the company he works for has effectively repurposed UAT testers into security testers, and the absence of having that understanding of what we do as security professionals really undermines the quality of that work, and as an end state it means we miss out on things and we lose holes. And a lot of this ties into this next slide of how we learn as well is starting to evolve, especially as industry starts to build. We're seeing now this whole concept of a cyber notion of education in universities. We now have cyber degrees in an environment that has not necessarily, a learning environment that's not necessarily being conducive to formal education. an academic I spoke to very recently, who's doing a lot in early childhood education, has thrown away the belief that something like a keyboard is now necessary for a student to learn. Everything can be learned off an iPhone or an iPad, and well, realistically, it's just a sealed box with things flashing up on it. There's not as much you can learn, and then there's also the actual pressure of, well, our concept of assessing and validating someone's knowledge is now done in the form of a multiple choice question or a 3-hour exam where you regurgitate everything that you've been told, and therefore you're educated. How we got to that, I don't know, but events like this, our notion of training and education and what we learn and how we get educated is vastly different, and the outcome of it is well, as I'm sure you've seen from the previous talks, there's a lot more value from it than what we're seeing. So I talk about Recon and Recon as a means of exploration and learning things. I look at it in the sense of me as a pen tester. For me, this is my bread and butter of what I do. A lot of the work I do with my customers involves actually learning and discovering about who they are, what they do, and how am I going to ruin their day. I made a number here of about 30-60%. Is really understanding who they are long before we actually engage or interact with them. So before we start firing off exploits or shooting packets downrange, there needs to be that fundamental understanding of what that organisation about or what their client's about. But fundamentally for me, that longer process leading to that face-to-face engagement, so to speak, or that computer-to-computer engagement with the client, makes my job easier. It allows me to actually prepare things properly so that I'm not all of a sudden sending out a shit tin of packets and hoping something comes back. It allows me to provide a better evaluation of who they are from a security standpoint and what their organisation's about. The other thing is, a lot of blue teams, that is to say the defensive groups or even the sysadmins, don't actually understand what's on their own network, and that's about 80% of their own defense is what's that attack surface and what does it mean for them. And that, what does it mean for them is important. I'll go into that a bit later. I also see a lot of places and a lot of pen testing organisations halfway or getting it plain wrong. A lot of scopes I get for engagements are, here is this address range, you will only send 20 packets an hour, and therefore security. A lot of the time, I tend to find that someone's sending you down a path that's going to be the path of least resistance for them. In the short term, here's my range, I know it's secure because I've looked at it, I probably haven't looked at something else. And it leads towards that bias of this is all you're going to look at. A pure reliance on tools is also something I observe. A lot of Pat did mention Maltego a bit there. I'll use Maltego here and there. For me though, I like actually just breaking things down and using raw tools off a command line, or just completely avoiding automation altogether. I had a bad experience a couple of years ago where a series of tools I was using caused me to be blacklisted and therefore no more access. Another one I see a lot of is threat intelligence. I was talking with a colleague in Sydney a few weeks ago who said he removed a threat intelligence organisation because they were getting, as he said, he was paying them $30,000 a month to Google his name. And all of a sudden, threat intelligence, we're keeping a close eye on who we are in our Recon win cybers. But getting on the right path, a big one for me is I had several years before going into the security space of building up some fundamental experience in how to run a network and what's there. I've also found context and familiarity with an environment or with an organisation has also helped a great deal in understanding something. So several companies I do long-term engagements for. Over time, I build up an understanding of who they are and what they're about. And whilst, say, within a digital space that may not be necessarily relevant, understanding how an individual operates takes time. And that actually leads into understanding how I'm going to be able to do something to them. Desire to know is another one. An engagement I did on a slightly larger scale a few months ago. I was with a couple of other guys doing an initial reconnaissance, and all of a sudden, because something didn't work, something didn't happen, everyone was deer staring. It was deer staring at headlights. Everyone just suddenly stopped, and there was no progression forward. There was no desire to troubleshoot or understand why something is so, and that's important to our job. An evil mindset also helps. It's comes back to, all right, we're doing this process of reconnaissance, but if we don't know exactly what something is or what we're looking at or what's bad about it, we're not really going to add as much value to our reconnaissance process as we would if we didn't. But within that, we have a couple of ground rules, especially around the reconnaissance process. I mean, my big one is well, do no evil. You're not here to be aggressive and carrying on, and even you're not there to start exploiting right away. It's about understanding things, and that kind of leads into my other thought of being objective. I have my own personal thoughts and views on certain things, which I have to square away when I start going through certain reconnaissance activities. You'll also see a lot of other people have certain biases. So you'll have, say, a privacy person all of a sudden start jumping up about SSL, oh my god, and they'll say something's not getting encrypted, and that'll be the one thing they concentrate on. Or I refer to it as Sterling Archer syndrome, where there's, you see it all, say again? Sorry. You see a lot of people in slightly larger organisations all of a sudden start making assumptions based on certain findings, or even long before they start an engagement, they already have that bias towards, this is exactly how I'm going to own them, and it's once again those blinkers on, this is the only way we can do it. All of a sudden we've added value without fully appreciating everything that's there. My last 2 points kind of stick to scope as best as possible. What I mean by that is have a structure to how you're going to execute a reconnaissance activity. Admittedly, as you go through it, you'll start to see certain patterns or certain things, and you'll have to break away. But having that structure sort of gets you back on track and keeps you within a time frame, because you'll end up running around in circles. And within that, everyone has their own different way, so learn from it. As I was writing this presentation, there are a few little tools, tricks, and hints. People were telling me over a few beers of, hey, I'm doing this talk. Have you thought about inserting this into your talk? So in the context of an external penetration test for a lot of the companies I engage with, I try and divide up my reconnaissance activities into 3 broad areas: digital, social, and physical. Digital is usually about 80% of my work. Usually that's because where most clients want me to concentrate, especially in Australia. I think we neglect the social and physical aspects of penetration testing. You're starting to see that change a little bit, but there's, if nothing else, they're certainly interesting, and they can certainly flow into that digital space. So when I talk about digital reconnaissance, actually, just to come back on one point there, firstly, whatever you're actually testing, identify the organisation and understand who they are and what they do. So, for example, are they a mining company, and therefore, what's their threat profile? What are they going to be concerned about? Doesn't necessarily change your recon too much, but it starts to feed into your thinking as you start going through a target. I also make a point of looking up their ABN and some of their financial details, or ACN. and also going through their brochureware site. There's usually a lot of information there about that basic context. So domain identification. Usually in Australia, that's associated with an ABN or an Australian business number, an Australian company number. And if not that, then you at least will have a username, most of which can be looked up through Whois or a heap of databases online. I do note, make a note of bgp.ag.net at the bottom. Heaps of data on there on that sort of stuff, especially with Whois lookups. Yep. So Whois search engines will usually start helping you identify those domains and who's there. Reverse DNS lookups are also important as well. For me, I like getting a heap of data off Scans.io on reverse DNS lookups. Interesting one. I picked this up a couple of years ago with Telstra, where their allocation of host names will actually be a particular value and a number .telstra.net. The number, interestingly enough, you can increment through. So, for example, you'll start identifying remote sites that you may not necessarily be able to locate elsewhere. So, once we've identified those domains, we start enumerating, well, what's under these domains? The level of noise you want to go to will vary. If you're not trying to be noisy, Google helps a lot, especially just a few Google hacking database terms there. But if you're really going to start picking up a bit of aggression there, brute forcing domains as well. There's plenty of tools on Kali and elsewhere to increment through a series of domain names. Also, it's important to understand different record types as well, such as mail records, as well as host records, and as well. BGP records are also important, most of which you can identify on bgp.ag.net. You'll also see other elements of that indexed on Google as well. So, all right, we've identified domains, we've identified hosts within those domains. What's next? So, understanding what hosts there are and also identifying other hosts that may be associated with the company as well is about our next stage here. So that's identifying what hosts are there. Interestingly enough, you'll also see that where a particular host has been identified on a range, there may in fact be several hosts adjacent to it based on IP address allocation. I also note Class B ranges as well. You'll see in Australia, for example, just about every university has allocated a /16. So that's just over 65,000 IP addresses, and in most cases, you also observe it's starting to change a bit. You also observe that some of these universities have not natted because they just haven't. Common services and banner grabbing as well. That's usually where you start generating a little bit more noise, and that's something to really start to consider. Sometimes, in fact, I've really only been caught about 10% of the time if I start just identifying what services are available and internet facing. Another one within that, ping does not always equal a live host. That's a common one I see in a lot of junior pen testers, especially when they come over from a networking background. The assumption that ICMP automatically will tell you that a host is live or not. Identification of hosts in the cloud era. I come back to Scans.io. Another really cool one with some of their data sets is they have they'll actually have the SSL certs that may not necessarily be lookupable by host name, but you'll be able to identify certs based on prior scans. Third-party providers. So, for example, a lot of organisations will start outsourcing mail to spam filters or other services. Interesting thing to note is, are those third-party service providers also secure as well, or are they also going to be in scope of a testing activity? I always like to think they are. things to be conscious of when you're doing this digital reconnaissance process. Think about what technology the developer, the organization and the developers are using. For example, one thing I see a lot of, ASP.NET will actually, the simple case, ASP.NET, for example, several organizations I see will be using it. One of the things I'll reorientate to when I'm doing web application security testing there is I tend to find, this is from personal experience, authentication and access control bugs tend to be more prevalent in those systems than they would in say, a lot of others. Identification of defensive technologies, if they're there as well, so identifying response times or even if there's an F5 there that's standing out. Other things within, say, web applications or sites that can be deduced, comments, document properties, any processes an organization follows, they all start to feed into that process of identifying the organization. So I did mention before, social is the reconnaissance, reconnaissance against social networks or against points where customers interact is another one. A forensics investigation I did back in December identified that a particular organization was getting targeted through a secondary school that two or three of their students, that two or three of the employees' children had also attended. So understanding an individual's social footprint also helps here as well. LinkedIn and Facebook are of course the common ones, and they can help with understanding what sort of person a system administrator is. Do they show off? Are they out there? Whirlpool used to be really good for finding things such as domain names or code or usernames that are commonly used by administrators. What's actually quite interesting there is when they also start using those same names on other forums. Or one case we found a system administrator who was also an RSVP as well. So possibly a target for social engineering. But all those start to come in as considerations if social engineering just so happens to be in context, in scope for this for an actual penetration test. And that also, if we're not doing social engineering, or we're not looking at the social context, a lot of organisations I find also aren't looking at the physical context. Identification of corporate locations and mapping them out also feeds into this a little bit. Even things such as data centres, remote sites, especially if an organisation is doing manufacturing or any OT work as well. Vehicles mobility is also often disregarded, especially as we start seeing technology get expanded in that space. Even looking at a physical site and possible physical security controls are also interesting. I recently did a blog about this door specifically. Can anyone tell me what's wrong with that? So you'll actually see here actually you probably won't see that particularly well. There's about a half centimetre gap in the door, a metre from which there's a sensor to open up. That was just something I saw on a client site several months ago, and you're starting to see. I'm seeing a lot of that in Sydney as offices get these flashy new fit outs with low frequency HID cards. But those then tend to be the things that you start to tie all together. So, for example, a series of information displayed in an individual's social profile may also be relevant to an organisation's digital security posture. Same goes physical security. Places not particularly well locked down may also allow access to a computer room or a server room. that tie-in factor tends to be something that gets paid off a lot, not only in those three contexts we're doing Recon on, but even within, say, the digital space, understanding, for example, a production environment behind an F5, understanding that the IP address adjacent is the exact same box, just not behind an F5, is one thing that that people just don't think through. Additional sources of data. Several years ago, I was using output from the Kana botnet. A lot of that's changed. The Kana botnet itself, someone thought it would be a great idea to take over 500,000 hosts, scan the internet, and provide all the data online. There was some really interesting stuff out of that. Shodan is also another good one to use here and there. Really more so to augment some of the things you start finding in those earlier stages. Scans.io, there's a heap of data there to also start running through as well. For those of you who saw me here last year with my backpack, or have seen the talks I've given on page messages, a classic case there was we were able to identify messages getting sent to engineers with change control request numbers to get access to a data center. There's actually another one I've seen recently with a series of messages getting sent that also had the pin to access a particular building. Things like that tend to start feeding into that whole picture on a target. Even things such as identifying where 802.11 networks are and any captures you've got there. Sources of compromise also contain usernames and passwords as well. And it's surprising how many users just increment their password up and down or change a few characters about, if they change it at all. If you really want to start getting exhaustive, defacement archives are great sources of where a customer's been compromised in the past. They tend to be not as relevant as they used to, I find, but they're just interesting to go through if nothing else. Archive.org may also contain old website data, may even have some old login details or old manuals or what have you. The Google Hacking Database as well contains a heap of interesting strings, as does Bing. I've actually found, probably in the last 6 to 12 months, searching through Bing, there's a lot more things that inadvertently get indexed that really just shouldn't be over Google. That's starting to change. It's actually getting really cool. As well as index document repositories. A friend of mine recently found a heap of banking details on Glyphy, which he passed off to said bank, and that was promptly resolved. So outside the context of a professional engagement, I like hunting around for things on the internet just to see what's there. More so just for my own interest, and also just for that development to feed into penetration testing. It's surprising how many places still actually have unauthenticated VNC pointing out to the internet. That's one so this was actually a healthcare provider in Melbourne the IP address was associated with, so this was just something I just passed up. Hey guys, this is pointing out to the internet, you may want to look at it. Another one was a website I came across about 3 months ago, where just going to it, all of a sudden I had admin access to a fuel management system in Melbourne. And, click on the URL, whoa, what's this? Okay, interesting. Got into contact, I was able to actually identify about 5 or 10 more of these based on reverse DNS lookups, as well as a couple of other data sets I had. Passed it off to the guy who's listed as the contact here. This got fixed in about 8 hours, which was pretty awesome. I'm pretty sure it was just as simple as restricting access to a certain number of IPs. I'm also finding a lot in Bing right now. I'm not too sure if you can see that. This is a username and password getting submitted in a GET request that's inadvertently been indexed by Google. Same goes with the other one as well. This one. So the reason why that one's heavily redacted is because I'm pretty sure it still hasn't been resolved yet. Not that I've logged on or anything. This bottom one, given the individuals involved, they responded to that in about 24 hours, which is pretty awesome. But once again, things that aren't necessarily in the context for me of a penetration test that are still kind of relevant and meaningful to someone else. So they're things I've, of course, passed on. Another one I'm seeing a lot of, and it's something I'm really keen to start looking at a lot more, building control systems. So did anyone remember the Google hack that happened in about 2013? Piedmont, the Google Wharf 7 down in Piedmont, a couple of guys found a security bug. The problem was, though, there were about 5 buildings within 200 meters of that still had not been patched for that bug as of about a year or two ago. These guys thankfully have patched. I was able to pass a lot of this information up to the right people. But those are ones that have been promptly fixed. Look, I suppose the crux of this talk is really we're starting to lose that craft of penetration testing, going from identification to exploitation down to what could probably be best classified, as I said before, as almost a UAT style of testing of run a specific tool that assesses an application against a certain process and therefore security. For me, understanding clients and even understanding some of the stuff that's out there plays an important role in that professional development for me. There's heaps of stuff still out there on the internet that's incredibly vulnerable. Understanding what's there and understanding all the things is important, if not satisfying for me as a method of learning things. That's it from me. If you've got any questions, my email's up there, and I think we've still got some time for questions.